Few words describe the 1920s better than prosperity, right? It's the prosperity decade, the roaring 20s, and it's unprecedented. In fact, a lot of people are saying during the 1920s that the poverty is going away and perhaps could be even eliminated. Really ironic, however, because if you consider what's coming about at the end of the 1920s. Underneath this era of prosperity, there are some rotten foundations, some weaknesses underneath. And of course, we focused more on the prosperity and ignored the weaknesses. Then it collapsed, starting in 1929, into what's known as the Great Depression, the worst economic disaster in the history of the United States. So, what we need to do first is explain the prosperity, and then we can explain the collapse. Keep in mind that when it does collapse, it's going to discredit all the types of politicians that have supported this economics. Now, to try to explain the prosperity decade, and I'm not kidding about it, productivity during the 1920s increases like two-thirds. Fantastic expansions in productivity. Income increases, both national and income and in personal income. The American standard of living becomes the envy of the world. Now, what's behind this? What's making us so prosperous? One thing was the fact that there was a boom in traditional industries like construction. The construction industry boomed wildly during the 1920s, and several things are involved here. For example, the building of skyscrapers is going to be an enormous boost to the economy. For example, when you build the Empire State Building, think about what goes into a building. Millions upon millions of bricks, steel, aluminum, glass, all of these things are going to go into to making a building like the Empire State Building, right? Well, that's going to stimulate the local economy. You got to make the bricks, you got to make the glass, the steel, the aluminum, the glass, right? And of course, then you need to actually have somebody that is going to lay the bricks, that's going to install the glass. So jobs, production, is just going to stimulate the local economy. Not to mention the fact that people are going to go there. People still go to the Empire State Building as tourists, and they go all the way to the top to have a great view of New York City, right? Another part of construction booming during the 1920s is going to be in Florida. In the Miami Daily News in 1925 is going to have in one Sunday issue a running of 500 pages, much of it real estate ads. It's one of the biggest singles ever. Right now, the Florida boom is going to be slowed by a hurricane in 1926, but for a time that's really going to stimulate the economy. More important than this is going to be the boom in new industries. Now, what was the most important industry that's coming about during the 1920s? Automobiles, right? It's not new, but it comes into its own in the 1920s. And think about this. In 1915, we were producing less than 1 million cars a year. By 1928, we were producing 5.5 million. And of course, the car that defines the period, and it first came out in 1908, but now it's defining the period, is going to be the Model T. And it comes in every color as long as it's black. But by the 1920s, sales became a new thing, and newer models and more class-associated vehicles are coming to the forefront, like Lincolns and Chevys, right? Think about the stimulus to the economy due to this boom. Not only there will be more automobiles being made, but think about what goes into their construction. Just like the buildings had bricks, steel, glass, and all that good stuff, right? Think about a car, steel, rubber, glass, etc. Also, due to this increase, made an increase in the roads for these vehicles. Even the simplest concepts like service stations had to come about. And of course, we call them gas stations, right? And people need to work those gas stations, right? So you can see how much of a stimulus it would be just to have an automobile industry come to an age during the 1920s. There was the radio industry. Usually when we think about radios, we think about what's in our cars, and we tune into a station, right? But before the 1920s, radios were private communication devices, right? That basically sit in your room and you would turn the dials trying to communicate with intelligent life, right? Well, in the 1920s, radio becomes a commercial thing. It becomes like what we're used to. Radio becomes more stations, right? Well, think about manufacturing into this. How many radios can you sell? Well, how many rooms do you have in your house? Just look around your house and figure out how many TVs you have. I'm thinking right now, I think I got 3, right? I got 3 TVs in my home. So, and just change the word TV to radio. Heck, you can and you can see at least a bare minimum of the radios you can have in your house, right? And heck, you can put more. You can put radios in every room of your house because they're so small, right? So by the time you get to the 1920s, there's going to be commercial radio stations. And by the end of it, 700 commercial radio stations are going to be operating in the United States. So the radio industry was another major stimulus. How about motion pictures? It becomes a big business in the 1920s. Now you might ask yourself, why are movies going to be a part of this stimulating the economy? Well, first, you got to make them, and that's going to create jobs. And of course, now you have to have places to show them. More jobs. And one thing you might be interested in is that air conditioning was first introduced in the 1920s in theaters. Synthetics came into being, as well as rayon and plastics during the 1920s. Things like vacuum cleaners, wristwatches, and other novelties we rely on today had their start in the 1920s. Industrial engineering, a fancy word for efficiency at work, really comes off here. We have new methods in production. It develops things like the assembly line. With the assembly line, Ford can reduce the time it takes to build a Model T from 9 hours to just 60 minutes. And it's amazing how it assisted the big boom in the economy and productivity of the 1920s.